not pay us the money that we wanted because the script was so expensive. So I told him that we usually stay home during the Academy Award, and he paid us our money, and if he bought us the Oscar, I give him...
They believed Elvis passed away surrounded by wealth, fame, and everything a superstar could want. But one accountant knew the real story, and he kept it buried in a box for 4 decades. The numbers inside told a different tale, one that would have shattered the myth of the king. Why did the truth have to wait until now? In this video, we discover the dark, unknown side of the king's finance, the return of the ledger. The call came on a Tuesday morning in 2017, 40 years after Elvis passed away in that bathroom at Graceland. A lawyer in Memphis picked up the phone and heard a voice he hadn't expected to hear again. The voice of a man who used to sit in a back office counting Elvis Presley's money while the music played downstairs. The accountant was old now, his hands shaking when he held things, his memory clear about some decades and foggy about others. But he remembered the ledger, remembered hiding it in a box after Elvis passed away, remembered telling himself he would wait until the right time came. 40 years felt like enough waiting. He told the lawyer about the box in his attic, wrapped in plastic and tape, sealed since 1977. Inside was a ledger that nobody at Graceland ever officially signed off on, a book he kept separately because it tracked things that made people uncomfortable, things that didn't fit the story everyone wanted to tell about the king. The lawyer drove to the house that same week. The accountant met him at the door, smaller than he used to be, bent forward like the weight of all those years had pressed down on his shoulders. They climbed narrow stairs together, dust floating in the light from a small window, boxes stacked along the walls, holding pieces of a life that stretched back before most people listening to music today were even born. The box sat in the corner, exactly where the accountant said it would be. The tape had yellowed but held firm, the plastic crinkled and stiff. The lawyer used a knife to cut it open, peeling back layers until the ledger appeared, its cover dark and worn, its spine still tight. Pages that hadn't been touched in 4 decades sat waiting, ink preserved, numbers frozen in time. The accountant watched without speaking as the lawyer turned the first few pages. Line after line of spending, earning, moving, paying. Dates that marked tours and recordings, payments that went to people whose names most fans would never recognize. Every dollar that came in, every dollar that went out, all written down in careful handwriting that belonged to a man who knew exactly what he was seeing but couldn't stop it. This was not a book about fame or music or legacy. This was a book about money, about how it arrived and how it disappeared, about the machine that surrounded Elvis Presley and fed itself until nothing was left. The lawyer closed the ledger and looked at the accountant, understanding now why it had stayed hidden for so long, because once you opened it, you couldn't pretend anymore. Graceland reads, "The truth." The ledger arrived at Graceland 3 days later, carried in a leather case by the same lawyer who had opened the box in that dusty attic. He walked through the front door where tourists usually gathered, past the ropes and displays, into the private rooms where the family still made decisions about Elvis and everything his name still meant to the world. They gathered in a room upstairs, away from the public spaces, away from the gold records and jumpsuits behind glass. Lisa Marie was there, along with people who managed the estate, people who had spent years protecting what Elvis left behind. The lawyer placed the case on a long wooden table that had been in the house since before Elvis bought it, back when Graceland was just another mansion and not a museum. Nobody spoke when he opened the case and lifted out the ledger. The cover looked ordinary, the kind of book accountants used before computers took over, before everything became files and screens. But when he opened it and turned it so everyone could see, the room changed. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the pages themselves carried weight that pressed down on everyone looking at them. The first pages showed income, numbers that climbed into the millions during years when Elvis played Vegas and toured and recorded, when his face was everywhere and his voice came through every radio. The family nodded, recognizing these figures, numbers they had heard before in meetings and reports. This part made sense. This part felt safe. Then the lawyer turned more pages and the outgoing columns grew darker from the pressure of the pen. Like whoever wrote these numbers pressed harder, like the amounts themselves demanded more force. Money that left for planes and cars and houses, for people on payroll who seemed to multiply every year, for expenses that never appeared on official reports because they lived in this separate book, this hidden record. Lisa Marie leaned forward, her finger tracing down one column, stopping at a payment made to someone whose name she recognized from childhood. Someone who had been around the house constantly. Someone who never seemed to work, but always seemed to need money. The date was written in neat script, the amount in the thousands, the reason left blank. The estate managers began taking notes, writing down page numbers and categories, trying to organize what they were seeing into something that made sense. But the ledger resisted organization. It showed spending that overlapped and repeated, that covered the same expenses twice, that paid for things nobody remembered authorizing. This was not rumor anymore, not stories that people told at parties or wrote in unauthorized biographies. This was handwriting, real ink on real paper, dates that matched tours and events everyone could verify. Every number could be traced back to a moment, a decision, a person who took money and walked away while Elvis kept working. The family sat with the ledger for hours that first day, turning pages slowly, seeing their history rewritten, not with words, but with math. The numbers didn't lie, didn't soften the truth, didn't care about legacy or memory. They simply showed what happened, year after year, until the money that should have lasted forever ran out before the music stopped, where the money actually went. The ledger opened like a map of everything Elvis earned and everywhere it disappeared to, a trail of numbers that showed wealth arriving in massive waves and then scattering in 1,000 different directions before it could ever settle into something permanent, something safe. The income pages told a story everyone already knew, the story of a man who could fill arenas and sell records and make movies that brought in millions. During his peak years in the late 60s and early 70s, Elvis earned between $5 and $10 million annually, sometimes more when a tour stretched longer or an album sold better than expected. The numbers climbed steadily, relentlessly, the kind of income that should have built dynasties and secured futures for generations. But the outgoing pages told a different story, one that nobody had seen laid out so clearly before. The ledger tracked spending like footprints in snow, each mark showing exactly where the money went and who took it with them when they left. Homes purchased for people who worked for Elvis. Sometimes people who barely worked at all but stayed close enough to ask for things. Cars that appeared in driveways overnight, paid for in cash, handed over like gifts that cost what most families earned in years. The planes stood out the starkest in the accounting, 2 of them, purchased within months of each other because one wasn't enough, because having 2 planes meant something more than having one. The Lisa Marie cost over $250,000, then hundreds of thousands more in customization, gold-plated seatbelts and suede-covered walls, and a bedroom that flew 30,000 feet above the ground. The Hound Dog 2 came next, smaller but still expensive, still burning money, just sitting on the tarmac waiting to fly somewhere. The family read through pages of jewelry purchases, furs and cars and electronics given away almost compulsively, like Elvis couldn't stop the generosity even when the bank account started showing strain. The ledger showed patterns, weeks where spending doubled or tripled without explanation, months where the outgoing numbers nearly matched what came in, leaving almost nothing behind to grow or invest or save. And then there were the people, names appearing again and again in the expense columns, the Memphis Mafia and their families, their needs and wants folded into the budget like permanent fixtures, housing allowances and medical bills and spending money that added up to salaries without ever being called salaries. Some of these people worked security or managed logistics, but others simply existed in Elvis's orbit, taking what was offered because it kept being offered, because nobody ever said stop. The estate managers calculated rough totals as they read, trying to add up years of this scattered spending. Millions every year, sometimes 3 or 4 million just in what the ledger called discretionary expenses, money that left without building anything permanent, without creating the kind of wealth that should have surrounded someone as successful as Elvis Presley. The family began to understand something that felt almost impossible to accept, that Elvis had earned enough to stay wealthy forever, but had spent like someone who believed the money would never stop coming, like someone surrounded by people who made sure it never stopped going out. The divorce pages. The ledger slowed when it reached 1973. The pages suddenly heavier with entries that stretched across multiple lines, numbers that kept growing as the lawyers talked and the marriage ended, and Priscilla walked away with pieces of everything Elvis had built. The divorce appeared in the ledger not as one number, but as a cascade of them, spreading across months and then years, reshaping Elvis's entire financial landscape in ways he never recovered from. The initial settlement hit first. $5 to $6 million transferred in a single agreement, money that represented years of work in tours and recordings. Gone in the stroke of a pen, signing papers that dissolved the marriage everyone thought would last. But the settlement was only the beginning, only the first wound in what became a financial hemorrhage that never fully stopped. The ledger showed child support payments written forward into the future, $4,000 every month for Lisa Marie, payments that would continue until she turned 18. Money that left like clockwork regardless of what else was happening, regardless of whether Elvis was working or resting, or struggling to keep everything else afloat. Priscilla received half of the sale proceeds from the house they had shared in California, another $1 million+ that appeared in the ledger as a single devastating line item. She kept the 1971 Mercedes, the 1969 Cadillac, and a percentage of future royalties from songs recorded during their marriage. Small percentages that still meant thousands leaving every month, every year, forever. The legal fees stacked quietly in their own column, costs that multiplied as the divorce dragged through courts and negotiations and revisions. Monthly attorney retainers, bills for depositions and document reviews, and court appearances seemed to generate more bills just by existing. By the time the divorce finalized, Elvis had spent nearly $500,000 just on the process of ending his marriage. Money that bought him nothing except signatures on documents that divided what he thought was his. Before the divorce, the ledger showed money coming in faster than it left. Accounts that grew despite the generous spending, despite the entourage and gifts and planes. After the divorce, the balance shifted permanently. Spending that already stretched too far now had to cover millions in settlements and ongoing payments, while the income stayed roughly the same. The estate managers found notes in the margins written in the accountant's careful hand, small warnings about cash flow and liquidity problems, suggestions about reducing expenses or restructuring debt. But the notes stopped after a few months, like the accountant realized nobody was listening, like he understood that Elvis couldn't change course even when the numbers screamed that he should. The divorce pages showed the family the exact moment Elvis stopped building wealth and started just trying to survive it. The moment when everything he earned became spoken for before it even arrived. The cost of loyalty. The names appeared like a chorus throughout the ledger, showing up month after month, year after year. A roster of people who surrounded Elvis and became part of the machinery that consumed his wealth without ever stopping to ask if the money would last forever. The Memphis Mafia started as friends and cousins and childhood connections who came to help when Elvis needed security and companionship during the early fame years. Back when having people around felt necessary and the money seemed infinite. But the ledger showed how friendship transformed into employment without clear job descriptions, how loyalty became expensive in ways nobody calculated until the accountant started writing it all down in this hidden book. The payroll pages stretched across dozens of entries every month, salaries for bodyguards and drivers and assistants and companions, some making legitimate wages for real work, but others collecting checks for just being there, for keeping Elvis company during long nights when he couldn't sleep, for laughing at jokes and staying close and never saying no when he wanted to do something reckless or generous, or both at the same time. Beyond the salaries came the expenses that multiplied like ripples spreading across water. When Elvis traveled, everyone traveled. 20 or 30 people moving like a small army from Memphis to Vegas to Los Angeles to wherever the next show or recording session waited. The ledger tracked flights and hotel suites and rental cars and meals, entertainment costs that appeared under vague categories like tour support or promotional expenses. Thousands of dollars every week, just keeping the entourage mobile and fed and housed in the style Elvis believed they deserved. The homes came next in the accounting, houses purchased or rented for members of the inner circle, property scattered around Memphis where friends and employees lived rent-free, utilities and maintenance paid by Elvis, repairs handled whenever something broke. The ledger showed one house purchased outright for a cousin, another leased long-term for a bodyguard's family, down payments made on condos for people who worked intermittently, or sometimes not at all but stayed loyal, and close and available whenever Elvis called. Then there were the parties and the nights that blurred together in casino lounges and hotel penthouse suites, entertainment that the ledger carefully categorized but couldn't fully capture, food bills that reached thousands for single evenings, bar tabs that showed consumption beyond what any reasonable gathering would need, The accountant's notes suggested these nights cost between $5,000 and $10,000 each, and they happened weekly, sometimes more often during Vegas residencies when the shows ended late and the energy needed somewhere to go. Medical expenses appeared scattered throughout, clinic visits and prescriptions, and private doctor calls for members of the entourage. Healthcare costs that Elvis absorbed because someone needed help, and he couldn't say no, because saying no meant being the kind of person who abandoned people when they struggled. The ledger showed patterns of the same names appearing in medical billing sections, addictions being treated and managed and treated again, cycles that cost thousands monthly and never seemed to resolve, just continued draining resources while Elvis kept paying and hoping things would get better. The estate managers calculated the totals across multiple years, checking their math twice because the numbers seemed impossible. The Memphis Mafia and the lifestyle that surrounded them cost more than $1 million every year, sometimes approaching $2 million when tours stretched long and the parties grew larger and the generosity flowed without limits. Friendship had become the most expensive thing Elvis owned, more costly than the planes or the cars or even the divorce. Because unlike those other expenses, friendship demanded payment every single day. When work became survival, the Vegas contracts appeared in the ledger like chains wrapped around Elvis's schedule, binding him to stages and hotels and performances that stretched from weeks into months, from occasional appearances into something that felt more like imprisonment than opportunity. Work that stopped being a choice and became the only way to keep everything from collapsing. The first Vegas contract in 1969 looked promising on paper. 4 weeks at the International Hotel for $125,000 per week. Numbers that seemed enormous and felt like validation after years away from live performance. The ledger showed that money arriving and immediately flowing back out to cover debts and expenses and the expanding operation that surrounded Elvis everywhere he went. But at least in those early years, the contracts left breathing room, weeks off between engagements, time to rest and record and live something resembling a normal life. Then the contracts multiplied and merged together, the breathing room disappearing as Colonel Parker negotiated longer residencies for more money that somehow never felt like enough. By the early 70s, the ledger showed Elvis playing Vegas for 8 weeks straight, then 10, then 12, doing 2 shows a night for 6 nights a week, performing the same songs in the same room for the same kinds of crowds while his voice grew tired and his body strained, and the prescriptions increased to help him sleep after shows and wake up before them. The money looked impressive in the income columns, sometimes $1 million for a single engagement, sometimes more when the contracts included bonuses or percentages of ticket sales. But the outgoing columns grew to match the income, expenses rising to meet every dollar that came in, like the operation had learned to consume exactly what Elvis could earn and not a penny less. The divorce payments left on schedule, the payroll processed every month, the houses and cars and planes demanded maintenance and fuel and insurance, and all of it depended on Elvis being on that stage every night doing the work that kept the machine running. The touring contracts appeared next to the Vegas dates, opportunities that should have been chances to break the routine and play for different audiences in different cities. But the ledger revealed touring as just another obligation, more dates stacked on top of Vegas commitments, performances scheduled so tightly that Elvis sometimes flew overnight between cities to make shows work around his residency calendar. The income from touring helped, added hundreds of thousands to accounts that needed every dollar. But it also meant Elvis never stopped, never had months to disappear and heal and remember why he loved performing in the first place. The family reading these pages decades later could see the trap forming line by line, date by date. The way work that should have been liberating became the only thing preventing financial disaster. Every contract Elvis signed committed him to more shows that generated more income, that paid for more expenses, that required more shows in an endless cycle that nobody seemed able or willing to break. The accountant's notes mentioned exhaustion and health concerns, suggested scaling back or restructuring or finding ways to reduce overhead. But the contracts kept getting signed and the shows kept happening, because stopping meant watching everything collapse immediately. The ledger showed Elvis caught in a machinery of his own creation, surrounded by people depending on his income, locked into contracts that demanded performances, regardless of how he felt, working not because he wanted to anymore, but because survival required it, because the alternative was admitting that everything had grown too large and too expensive, and too dependent on one man staying on stage until his body finally refused to continue. The final imbalance. The ledger's last years read like a countdown nobody wanted to acknowledge. Pages where the careful balance that had always existed between earning and spending finally tipped permanently into something unsustainable. Something that mathematics alone could have predicted long before Elvis collapsed in that bathroom in August of 1977. The income started softening in 1975, not dramatically at first, but enough that someone paying attention should have noticed the trend and responded with alarm. Vegas contracts that used to guarantee $1 million per engagement now brought in $800,000 or $700,000 as attendance dropped slightly. As the novelty of Elvis's return to live performance aged into routine, as younger audiences discovered newer acts and older fans couldn't afford to see the same show year after year. Touring revenue held steadier, but required more effort, more cities and more nights to generate the same totals, pushing Elvis harder for returns that kept shrinking relative to the work demanded. Record sales appeared in their own column, royalties arriving quarterly, but declining with each statement, as Elvis's last few albums failed to capture the cultural moment the way his earlier work had. The ledger showed payments dropping from hundreds of thousands per quarter to tens of thousands, sometimes less. Music that should have been generating passive income barely contributing to accounts that needed every possible revenue stream just to stay balanced. But the spending never softened to match the declining income, never adjusted to reflect the reality that less money was arriving, while all the same obligations and expenses and people remained exactly as costly as they had been during the peak earning years. The divorce payments left like clockwork, $4,000 every month for child support, plus the ongoing royalty percentages that kept taking their share. The payroll continued processing at full strength, 20 or 30 people collecting checks regardless of whether Elvis was working or resting, regardless of whether the current income justified that many people on permanent salary. The planes and the houses and the cars still needed maintenance and insurance and fuel, fixed costs that didn't care about revenue trends or market conditions. Medical expenses actually increased in these final years, prescriptions multiplying as Elvis's health deteriorated, doctor visits becoming more frequent and more expensive, treatments that tried to address symptoms without ever solving the underlying problems of exhaustion and addiction, and a body breaking down under decades of pressure and pharmaceutical management. Then the loans appeared, entries that showed up quietly at first, but grew more frequent and more desperate as the imbalance widened. Advances against future earnings, borrowing that mortgage tours and albums that hadn't happened yet, taking tomorrow's money to pay for yesterday's expenses because today's income no longer covered the gap. The estate managers found entries in the final pages that suggested Elvis knew about the problem, meetings with the accountant marked in the margins, discussions about reducing overhead or selling assets or restructuring the operation. But nothing changed. The spending continued at the same pace because changing would have meant disappointing people or admitting a failure or confronting how unsustainable everything had become. Choices that felt impossible for someone who had always been generous and confident and unwilling to show weakness. The last entry appeared in June of 1977, 2 months before Elvis passed away, showing income from a recent tour barely exceeding the monthly expenses, leaving almost nothing in reserve. Nothing saved for emergencies or slow periods or the future that would never arrive. The ledger showed debt forming not suddenly but gradually, mathematically, inevitably, the natural result of years where spending exceeded earning, and nobody with power to change things ever did. Why? It was hidden. The accountant kept the ledger secret for 40 years, not because he was protecting Elvis from scandal or shielding the family from painful truths, but because releasing it earlier would have destroyed the myth that sustained everything the Presley name had become after death. The image that made Graceland profitable and kept the music selling and allowed everyone who depended on Elvis's legacy to continue earning from his memory. The official story, after 1977, was that Elvis passed away at the height of his fame and fortune, that he left behind an estate worth millions, that the financial struggles mentioned in occasional tabloid stories were exaggerations or misunderstandings about how celebrity wealth worked. The narrative presented Elvis as extravagant but successful, generous but solvent, a man who lived large because he could afford to live large, whose death was tragic, but whose financial legacy was secure. The ledger destroyed that narrative completely. showed something far more uncomfortable than simple excess or carelessness. It proved Elvis didn't die broke by accident or through reckless spending on hard substances and parties, but through systematic draining by an operation that consumed wealth faster than even extraordinary success could generate it. The pages showed neglect, not by Elvis, but of Elvis. People and systems taking and taking, while he worked himself literally to death, trying to feed an appetite that could never be satisfied. Because the ledger showed that Elvis was trapped, not careless. That he understood the problem but couldn't escape it. That he was surrounded by people whose livelihoods depended on him never stopping or scaling back or protecting himself. The divorce took millions he couldn't refuse to pay. The entourage consumed millions he couldn't bring himself to cut off. The contracts demanded performances he couldn't afford to cancel, because canceling meant immediate financial collapse for dozens of people beyond just himself. The myth was easier to accept than the truth. Easier to believe that Elvis partied too hard and spent too much and passed away young because rock stars live dangerously. The truth was that Elvis spent his final years working desperately to feed a machine that had grown larger than he could support, performing when he was sick because the alternative was watching everything crumble, taking pills to keep going because going was the only option anyone around him would accept. The accountant waited 40 years because releasing the ledger in 1978 or 1985 or 1995 would have seemed cruel, would have looked like an attack on a man who couldn't defend himself, would have damaged the estate and the family, and everyone who depended on Elvis's image remaining untarnished by the ugly mathematics of how he actually lived and passed away. But 40 years created enough distance, enough time for the people who consumed him to fade from relevance, enough perspective for the truth to serve as warning rather than accusation. The ledger came forward not to destroy Elvis's memory, but to complete it, to show that his tragedy wasn't weakness or stupidity, but something more systemic and sad. The story of someone talented and generous and human who got consumed by people and systems and obligations that took everything until nothing remained. After 40 years, the ledger finally spoke, and what it said was simple and chilling, that Elvis Presley didn't die broke by accident. He was drained in plain sight by people who loved him and needed him and couldn't afford to let him stop, even when stopping was the only thing that might have saved him.